Hello and welcome to ATTRA's Voices from the Field. I'm agriculture specialist Nina Prater, and I'm joined by my colleagues Darron Gaus and Lee Rinehart to continue our plant nutrient series. We are working our way through the essential plant nutrients and have covered nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and calcium in previous episodes. And now we are going to explore another important macronutrient, sulfur. I admit I didn't know a lot about sulfur before going down the research rabbit hole for this episode. The only thing I really knew about sulfur was that it is smelly. But I've learned a lot. The history of this element, along with how important sulfur is in agriculture. And I'm excited to share what I've discovered with you today. And Darron and Lee have been doing their own exploration into this pungent element, so I can't wait to hear what they've dug up as well. So I'm going to start with a little bit about the history of sulfur, and then we'll go into the science of sulfur in the soil and plants, and some best practices for how farmers and ranchers can make sure their plants are getting enough sulfur to thrive. Welcome, Darron and Lee.
Hey, thanks, Nina. I'm glad to be back and contribute again. The calcium podcast was fun, so I'm ready to talk about sulfur.
Yeah, and this one has got a really good story too. And I learned an awful lot of things that I didn't know just by your research, Nina, in looking at the history and where we stand now. So I know that listeners are going to enjoy this episode.
Yes, I hope so. So just a little bit of backstory. You guys know I love etymology and finding out the history of the words themselves. I learned that sulfur comes from the Latin word sulfur.
Imagine that.
I know. But that comes from the Sanskrit word sulvari, which means to burn. And sulfur is also called brimstone. So if you've heard of fire and brimstone, they're talking about sulfur. So it makes sense that it's an ingredient in gunpowder. And it also is used in many industrial processes in the form of sulfuric acid. And I learned that the Egyptians used sulfur to bleach cotton way back around 1600 BCE. So it's been used for a long time. And I love literature, so I was very excited to find this reference. According to Homer, Odysseus used sulfur to fumigate his home after he murdered all of his wife's suitors when he came back from his time in the Iliad and the Odyssey and all of that. 20 years, comes back, kills all the suitors, and then he fumigates his home. And I had to look it up after I found this out. He tells his old nurse, Euryclea, "Bring me brimstone and a brazier, medicinal fumes to purify my hall." And that's before he's even seen his wife, Penelope. He fumigates his hall. That's like his first priority. Then Euryclea is like, "Yeah, but why don't you change out of your rags and get cleaned up?" And he's like, "No, we have to do the fire and brimstone. Then I'll change, and then I'll see my wife." So it's a big priority for Odysseus. I thought that was funny.
Well, yeah, he doesn't want to carry the smell into his wife's chambers.
Right. So the smell of sulfur's better? I don't know. Somehow it's medicinal, though, in his mind. So just to jump way forward in history, for most of the 20th century in the U.S., farmers, particularly in the eastern half of the U.S., didn't have to worry about adding sulfur to their fields every year. How can this be? In our past episodes on nutrients, we've talked about the law of return, where if you remove a nutrient from a field, just like when you withdraw money from your bank account, you have to replenish it or soon you'll run out, right? It doesn't just magically regenerate. So why didn't farmers have to worry about adding sulfur when they were removing it year after year in their crops? They had a free source of sulfur that resupplied their soils every year, and it came from acid rain. In the burning of fossil fuels like coal-fired power plants and things like that, people were emitting huge amounts of sulfur into the atmosphere, and that precipitated out in the rain and landed on all this farmland. But eventually, people realized that acid rain was a bit of a problem, and so the Clean Air Act that was passed in 1963 initially didn't really solve the acid rain problem. I read something that said in 1977, they made an amendment that said these companies should just not emit less fumes, but just make it taller so it distributes it farther away, so it doesn't impact the immediate community as much.
Someone else's problem.
Yeah, someone else's problem. Isn't that wild?
I don't know what to say. That just totally describes like Western industrialization. It does. Push it over there. Not in my backyard, but it's okay over there.
Right. So it didn't solve any problems really. It just protected the air quality a bit around that place. It wasn't until the 1990s that an amendment was added that actually encouraged companies to capture the sulfur dioxide, and I found out nitrous oxide. And so the industry had to add scrubbers to their smokestacks. And so that meant no more free sulfur for all the farmers. But ultimately, a win for water quality and for marble buildings that were getting eaten away by the acid rain. I grew up in Vermont, and I remember learning about this back in the 90s, that gravestones that were made out of marble were getting eroded, and marble buildings and things like that. Yes, we have resolved a lot of the acid rain problems, but that does mean that farmers have to think about sulfur as a fertilizer again.
But just think of that. Nobody really thought about sulfur all this time because of the fact that it was coming. I mean, it was an input. I mean, we were, burning fossil fuels and putting out stuff, emissions and such, and bringing back. But whenever we stopped that, all of a sudden, boom, over time, we start to see things like sulfur deficiencies. One of the things that I learned from your research, and I kind of did some of my digging too, is the fact that meant that sulfur for a long time was not mined like phosphorus is, as an element in agricultural production for fertility. We'll talk about that later whenever we talk about formulations and applications and such. But for a long time, it wasn't mined. But now we have to look for sources of sulfur.
Yeah, it is very different from other elements in that way. So it is interesting to compare the different elements in the history of whether they're super scarce, like phosphorus or nitrogen that has to be created through the Haber-Bosch process, things like that. It's very interesting to learn all the different pathways that we've had to find to get these nutrients. But for a long time, sulfur just rained from the sky. But going back to the air pollution aspect of sulfur, I found another story further back in history that has to do with the history of air quality. It's way back in the 1800s, and I just thought this was fascinating. So sulfur was used in the production of soda ash, and soda ash is an alkali like potash that's used in glass, textile, soap, and paper industries. And soda ash doesn't have sulfur in it, but sulfur was used as part of the process of making the soda ash. So it was part of the waste product of this process. So calcium sulfide was this solid waste that came from making soda ash. And it has a great name. I guess it's called Gallagoo, spelled Galligu. I don't know. Anyway.
Yeah, now I'm going to have to look up the etymology of that word.
Yeah. It's a great word. But anyway, it refers to this calcium sulfide waste, and it had no economic value, so it was just piled in heaps around these soda works, where it weathered to release hydrogen sulfide, the toxic gas responsible for the odor of rotten eggs. All of this led to one of the first set of laws to protect against air pollution. I found this quote in an 1839 lawsuit against these manufacturers, and it described the situation this way. The gas from these manufactories is of such a deleterious nature as to blight everything within its influence, and is alike baneful to health and property. The herbage of the fields in their vicinity is scorched. The gardens neither yield fruit nor vegetables. Many flourishing trees have lately become rotten, naked sticks. Cattle and poultry droop and pine away. It tarnishes the furniture in our houses, and when we are exposed to it, which is of frequent occurrence, we are afflicted with coughs and pains in the head, all of which we attribute to the alkali works.
Oh my gosh. The language. But that almost read beautiful, didn't it?
Yes, it's poetry. Yeah. The poultry droop and pine away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Poor things. So, because of this persuasive writing, I'm sure, in 1863, the British Parliament passed the Alkali Act, the first modern air pollution legislation. And the act required that no more than 5% of hydrochloric acid produced by the plants could be vented into the atmosphere. So they instead passed the escaping hydrogen chloride gas up through a tower of packed charcoal where it was absorbed by water flowing in the other direction. And then they dumped that into the nearby bodies of water. So killing all the fish and aquatic life there, but at least it wasn't going into the air.
But did it smell anymore?
Right. I don't know.
I'm sure all the dead fish smell probably covered any of that smell up anyway.
Yeah.
Not really related to sulfur in agriculture, but it was a part of environmental history that I'd never learned. And so I just thought I'd share it with everyone else. Jumping a little bit around geographically, we're going to now travel to Sicily. Sicily played a big part in sulfur history because, like you mentioned, Lee, we haven't really had to mine sulfur for a long time. But Sicily was where most of the world's sulfur came from for a long, long time. And there were sulfur mines there. I found a passage in an article by Joanna Lucarino, and the article's title is called, it's a bit of a spoiler, it's called Hell on Earth, the Sulfur Mines of Sicily. You can imagine what it was like there. So, and I just wanted to share this because it showed the human impact of this extraction. So here's a quote from that article. Pecunari, which is the Italian word for pickaxe workers, extracted the ore and loaded it into containers. They each had 2 to 4 young boys called carusi, which I guess means small child, who would carry loads of ore weighing up to 110 pounds on their backs. The carusi were indentured servants sold to overseers from as young as 4 to 7 years old. They suffered abuse by the older workers who were themselves abused. Carusi were forced to travel up and down the uneven, slippery steps of the surface many times each day. The steps were so narrow and steep, sometimes at an 80-degree angle, which could cause the young boys to fall and be injured.
Wow. So, that reminds me of what the workers who mined or collected the Chilean nitrate back in the day, they were abused in much the same way, indentured servitude. And can you imagine, just breathing the stuff? It must have been the same mining the sulfur.
I thought the exact same thing. These people with no agency being forced to mine this stuff. And the boys, like the little 4 to 7-year-old boys. I have a son.
Mm-hmm.
It really hits home when you picture it. So not a great industry. Being able to capture it in smokestacks, at least nobody has to go down in the mines for it anymore, which is, I'd say, a win.
Yeah. Did you find anything on, after it's captured from the smokestacks, is it pushed back into supply chain in any way to be used in other various manners, whether agricultural or industrial?
Oh, yeah. That's where we get all our sulfur now, is from these smokestacks. So that's a great question. Thank you for transitioning to my next.
Read your mind.
Since the Clean Air Act amendments of the 1990s, fast forwarding to today, 35 years later, we have huge amounts of sulfur captured in these smokestacks of manufacturing facilities. And according to the USGS, more sulfuric acid is produced in the United States every year than any other chemical. And it's from this capturing it from other manufacturing. So this kind of sulfur is known as environmental sulfur because it's captured to protect the environment, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's as opposed to elemental sulfur, which is sulfur that's been mined and is like the pure element. And it's put right into the manufacturing supply chain. So waste not, want not, right? The sulfur that used to fall to the ground as acid rain, it's just not anymore. It's being captured for the most part. And the effects are pretty astounding. According to the article, Revisiting the Role of Sulfur in Crop Production, and we can link to these articles in the show notes, the amount of plant available sulfur in the soil has decreased by 34 to 86% between 2000 and 2020, leaving crop production at risk.
Yeah, because those agricultural soils have been getting it for free for so long. And just think, I mean, that is a really significant drop, a win, I would say, for technology to protect and stop emissions, I would say. But boy, 34 to 86% drop in 20 years.
Yeah, it is a win for sure, but it does show like it's just slowly been extracted.
Yeah.
And not replaced. So demonstrates the need to start making sure there's enough in our soil for our plants or crops. And one thing that I noticed in a lot of the extension articles that I read about sulfur was basically they were arguing like, just because your grandparents didn't have to apply sulfur doesn't mean you don't have to, because we learned so much of how we farm from previous generations. But they grew up in a time when sulfur was just falling free from the sky, and we are not in that time anymore. So I thought that was a really interesting, like I could tell a lot of extension agents have had that conversation with farmers, like, well, my granddad didn't.
Yeah.
Why should I?
Oh, times they are a-changing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That kind of gets us to the present day. No more free sulfur falling from the sky. Maybe sulfur levels are getting a little lower in the soil. And so we're going to talk today about how farmers should be thinking about soil in our present conditions. And I'm going to turn it over to Darron to share what he's learned about this interesting element.
Yeah, I mean, that background is very interesting, and I think it brings to light a couple of different things here in the way that we also think of our sulfur cycling in the soil and why it's so important to the plants. And I'm going to kind of jump back and forth between those two, the sulfur cycling and why it's important to the plants, just to see that relationship along the line. So sulfur is considered a secondary macronutrient. We have 17, some say 18 essential nutrients for plants. And we have the macros being carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium as primary macros. Carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, the building blocks of sugars and energy, which is absorbed through the atmosphere and water. And then we have nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, which y'all discussed in the previous episodes. And then we have these secondary macros. We have calcium, sulfur, and magnesium. So maybe a little foreshadowing here for our next element in the series to round out our macronutrient discussions.
Start your research, Nina.
Yeah. So sulfur in relationship with nitrogen, there is a similar to like there's a carbon to nitrogen ratio that's kind of you aim for. There's also a sulfur to nitrogen relationship in the soil because the sulfur creates two essential amino acids that build most proteins, and that's methionine and cysteine. And so those amino acids, as we all know from our 9th grade science class, are the building blocks of protein, right? And so anything from the formation of chlorophyll, synthesis of oils, and we even, activate enzymes that aid in biochemical reaction. All start with those building blocks of methionine and cysteine, which cannot be created unless they have sulfur. So that means that sulfur could become a bottleneck in some pathways of plant growth, but it rarely does because of how sulfur cycles in the soil, especially those with high organic matter and microbiology. And so it's more of a right time and place over just the total amount in soils. As Nina said, before the Clean Air Act, farmers didn't have to worry about the sulfur too much because atmospheric deposits kept the cycle constantly flowing. But sulfur is fast moving and highly leachable. You just have to imagine the horizons of our soil. It's even if it comes in from the atmosphere, as we use irrigation, as it rains, that sulfur is going to just leach down further and further into those horizons. And that made me start thinking when I was doing this research, me being in Texas and We talked in the calcium podcast that I lived in an area that was high calcium soils, high pH soils. But yet, when you go out to the country and people that live in rural areas know that they have to drill a water well to get water, you don't get it supplied from the city if you live far enough away from the city limits. And at that same time that we would have these high calcium, high pH soils, you would also smell like rotten eggs when you took a shower. And so that I was like, how do those two relate? It seems like we're being told by extension to add sulfur to these calcium soils to reduce the pH, but yet it seems like there's a lot of sulfur down there in the water that we are drinking and bathing in. That's because it's highly leachable. It's fast moving and just gets down into our water table very quickly through the horizons of the soil. So for a plant, it's more important about that right time and right place, that sulfur is available when it needs to build those amino acids and create those enzymes to defend against diseases and pests. Many farmers use sulfur products for organic fungicide. It's not the interaction between the sulfur and the fungus that helps fight it. It's providing a timing for the sulfur to help create a pathway to create the biochemical agent that defends the plant by itself.
That blows my mind. So I always assumed, like, when I heard, oh yeah, you apply sulfur to kill fungus or whatever, that it, like, the sulfur was like acidic or something and killed the fungus, I don't know, through acid. This is my very rudimentary understanding. Like, I was just making up explanations. So when you say that, it makes me think, oh, I did not understand the mechanism behind how come sulfur is used as a fungicide. That's very interesting.
Yeah, and it's crazy to think about that bottleneck time period too. Like, just once you apply that, how fast that pathway continues on once it's readily available and can defend, itself against the fungus. And so luckily the microbiology in our soils also have sulfuric acid as a waste product, as they're quote unquote digesting in the soil and moving things around, moving nutrients around. One of those waste products is sulfuric acid. And they also create sulfide gas in anaerobic systems without oxygen. And so even when times of soil saturation where the pore spaces are filled with water, you get that big rain and clay soil and the pore spaces are completely filled with water. In that short amount of time, even though it's temporary, these hydrogen sulfide gases get created from hydrogen sulfur bacteria that create that hydrogen sulfide gas. And then it starts breaking down in the soil and starting the sulfur process cycle again as that water drains out. And so, hydric or even seasonally hydric soils often create an abundance of that hydrogen sulfide gas. And, we're talking about sulfur also has a smell to it. So if you've ever been in a swamp, kind of stinks, right? Well, that's because the abundance of hydrogen sulfide gas, the hydric soil, and the ability to take that anaerobic system and keep just pumping out that hydrogen sulfide gas. But even then, that most of that sulfur is still highly leachable. So it just keeps going further and further down into the soil horizons and not necessarily back up into where it needs to be in that topsoil layer. So there are more beneficial sulfur cycling microbiology that happens just in the right ratios of carbon to nitrogen and the organic matter to feed the diazotrophs, which are the nitrogen building, the nitrogen simplifying bacteria. One that we're commonly referred to is rhizobium. When you inoculate your legumes, you're applying a diazotroph to that to keep that nitrogen cycle going. Well, there's also sulfur reducing bacteria. The carbon keeps feeding the microbiology. The biology keeps breaking down and cycling those nutrients, specifically sulfur, in the topsoil and the rhizosphere directly around those plant roots. So that's where the more organic matter you have, the better microbiology you have. It just kind of takes care of itself to keep that sulfur cycling and be there in the right place at the right time. So just like the swamp, crops that benefit from the higher amounts of readily available sulfur are also the ones that we think of as stinky or pungent. Alliums, like onions and garlic, that stuff that makes you cry, that's sulfur.
I was fascinated when you first told me that, Darron. I didn't know it was sulfur.
Yeah, and also the cruciferous plants like broccoli, cabbage, kale, that's the sulfur. That's what we get. When people say it tastes like something, that's the sulfur. And so just speaking of the sulfur and amount of sulfur in broccoli and cruciferous vegetables, here's a real nerdy story for you. So my daughter was blessed with my very thin and very straight hair. And, she always sees in the movies these princesses with curly, thick hair. And so I'll catch her like looking in the mirror and she'll be playing with her hair and like, telling me, Daddy, I want big, beautiful curls like the, princess in the movies. And I said, well, curls in your hair are actually from disulfide bonds. She's only 5 years old, but I'm sure she understands what disulfide bonds are for sure. And that's the sulfur that creates the curls in your hair. And guess what? Broccoli has sulfur in it. So got to eat your broccoli if you want to have curly hair.
Oh, dude. I don't know if that's awesome or wicked. Did it work?
Oh, no. It doesn't.
That's so funny. Can I tell you a funny story? So my parents, when I was little and trying to make me eat broccoli, used to say it coagulates your blood, which did I know what that meant as a small child? No. Does it actually do that? Absolutely not. But that's what they said. So now they would for years say, oh, eat your broccoli. It coagulates your blood. So now I can say, and apparently it also makes your hair curly. Just makes me think, how many different things have parents come up with to try and get their kids to eat broccoli?
Yeah, and somehow it just ends up with ranch instead.
Here's my trick, roasting the broccoli. My kids will eat roasted broccoli, but not steamed broccoli. So I don't know, maybe it helps make it less sulfuric.
Yeah, maybe that roasting method brings more of the brimstone out of the broccoli.
We will have to do some culinary research next, I think.
So you guys are like way too thoughtful about that, because I would just tell my kids, it's like, well, you don't get up until you finish it. And that didn't work either, because I think I clocked it, an hour and a half of kids sitting there. It's like, they're going to outlast you.
Yeah. Gotta move on to other things.
But for most vegetables, we would do one of two things. We either cut them up really small and put them in a casserole, and that would usually work. Or just like let them free range in the garden. And honestly, during the growing season, that's where they got most of their vegetables. Because what was in the garden, they would eat it. They would love to go out there and just forage. But you brought it inside the kitchen, and all of a sudden, it was now dinner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my daughter always loved just foraging. That part of it, just in the garden, it was like cool. I got to find food outside.
Yeah.
And she would just instantly eat it, be eating bell peppers like an apple.
Mm-hmm.
But then she was introduced to the public school system and found easier method of intake that didn't taste like sulfur.
Uncrustables or something.
Yeah.
Oh dear. Yeah.
So yeah, just speaking of other things that may or may not work unless done at the right time, many farmers have high pH soils, like we talked about in the calcium episode, 7.5 or higher. They'll utilize elemental sulfur to bring down the pH into that sweet zone of 6.8 to 7.2-ish. Or, even blueberry producers, hydrangea, cut flower producers, they use it to keep that acidic environment that those, species like. But I learned from first accounts that it takes a lot of sulfur to lower the pH. And it also takes a long time to get to a usable state, before the plants actually need it, 6 months to a year out. And so I was told by my extension agent that in this clay soil, it's going to require 800 pounds of sulfur per acre to lower the pH by 1/10 of a point. And I'm looking at the bagged elemental sulfur prices at like $1 a pound, and doing the math real quick, I'm like, hey, that's $24,000 to lower the pH by 1 per acre. Now, I was like, I don't think that's capable. And even when I found it in bulk, the price was going to be like $9,000-$10,000 per acre to lower the pH by 1. So I kind of did not have that kind of liquid cash to to just worry about the pH. And, as you heard in the calcium podcast, I still did use the elemental sulfur, the rate was probably an eighth of what they told me to. And I would just put it in with my cover crop seedings so that, the cover crop would grow and also the sulfur would be breaking down and be usable for the next round of cash crop to be ready to plant. And honestly, that's where I saw the benefit of the plant health and soil health, was adding the organic matter with the cover crops over just the elemental sulfur alone. So yeah, we can move on. That's kind of the sulfur cycle, not only in the soil, but through the plant and then back into the soil. And so farmers utilize this in many different ways. And there's different types of sulfur that you can utilize. And, Lee, why don't you tell us more about how that sulfur is utilized in organic systems and lead us to the real take-home message about sulfur?
Oh, yeah, sure. You mentioned organic matter a couple of times, and, it's like, going back whenever I was a kid, going to Sunday school. The answer in Sunday school was always Jesus, right? That was always the answer. No matter what the question was, that was the answer we thought. But in farming, it's like the answer seems to almost always be organic matter, right? And I've been thinking about this, and as I was listening to you, Nina, talk about sulfur from acid rain and how it has been extracted, by cropping systems for so many years, after we kind of shut off in 2000, I guess, whenever we shut it off and started scrubbing it from the stacks. And so we saw this reduction. So we were extracting basically all that sulfur from the soil for so many years. If organic matter is helpful here with sulfur cycling, would an organic farming system, as opposed to like this intensive monocropping system that we've developed since the Green Revolution, what would that have done to mitigate that? Would we have seen less extraction of sulfur? I don't know. Philosophical question. Point is that organic matter works, right? It's certainly not a silver bullet, but it's, I think, the fundamental element that keeps our farming system sustainable, right? So as I've been thinking about this and thinking about adding sulfur, when do you add sulfur, how much, what types of sulfur do you add? Well, the first thing, of course, is soil test. Make sure that you get a baseline soil test to see what the sulfur levels, as well as the other macronutrients and organic matter, are within your soils. And so you'll kind of know where you're going and add accordingly based upon recommendations. I like to talk about the various types of sulfur that we can apply, especially for organic farmers who have the national list of allowed substances that they can use. And elemental sulfur, which was mentioned earlier, is certainly allowable by the National Organic Program. And the cool thing about it is much like inorganic sources of nitrogen, elemental sulfur can be readily converted to sulfate by bacteria for plant uptake, right? So there you go. It's like there's that microorganism initiated cycling, right? So you have good soil health. You've got this evidence by good soil aggregation, water holding capacity, all those benefits that we get from the addition of organic matter through compost and cover crops and green manures and livestock manures and things like this can really keep that system going. And then, with all that carbon feeding those soil bacteria, they can also convert, just like they do nitrogen, they can convert that elemental sulfur to a plant available form as well. But if you need to add elemental sulfur, it's really recommended that kind of processed into like a granule or a flake. Usually this is done with a binding agent like bentonite, which is clay, which is allowable under the organic programs. So elemental sulfur with bentonite is an allowed substance. So is calcium sulfate, which is gypsum. So that can be a binding agent as well. And there is sulfur in calcium sulfate. These need to be kind of bound with these additives into these granules or flakes, because whenever they're in these flakes, these materials will contain about 90% sulfur. With these fertilizers, like these elemental sulfur sulfur fertilizers, what happens is whenever it is applied, the bentonite that is within those flakes or granules will swell out in contact with water. And so then those sulfur particles will then disintegrate into particles of varying sizes, kind of helps with the availability of that sulfur over a long period of time. And just like Darren was saying about raising soil pH, it may take a while in order for that sulfur to become bioavailable, which is why a lot of farmers will apply sulfur if they need it according to soil tests, especially if they're using elemental sulfur in the late summer or the fall, something like that, especially if you can incorporate it so that you get that seed soil surface, get it into that soil profile so that the water can break it down. And then over the period of time, it can start reacting with soil bacteria. And then by the time you come up to your next growing season, you till in green manures and this and that, you've got this flush of biological activity that happens whenever you open up soil. You can start mineralizing some of this sulfur and making it plant available for your growing season. So like I said, the main sources, especially for organic farmers, are elemental sulfur and gypsum, but also composted manure. Right, livestock manure is a really good source of sulfur. Think about it. It's a building block of protein, which are needed by animals, right? And so certainly some of that is going to be passed, along with the nitrogen that passes through the alimentary canal of livestock. So does sulfur, and especially if you can compost that manure. You can compost it with elemental sulfur. You can compost it with gypsum, with rock phosphate as well. That really kind of helps with supplying sulfur in the manure, as well as helping to release phosphorus from that manure as well, having it composted. So that's a really good way that farmers can use sulfur if they're finding it deficient in the soils. Livestock grazing, manure, composting, elemental sulfur applications according to soil testing. One thing that is really cool that I found out, because I'm always looking at a way, so how can we do this? Is it even possible to never add any minerals to our soils whatsoever? Well, I don't think so. I mean, agriculture is, no matter how gentle and how light the footprint that we have on the land, is always going to be extractive in some manner, right? It's just the nature of it, right? And so that's why we're so careful with adding organic matter and having diversity in our crops and pastures and our animals, and having cover crops and keeping the soil covered and all this stuff, right? To build this ecosystem that really works and makes it sustainable. But so I'm always looking for, well, is there a way that I can just bring out whatever sulfur or whatever mineral might be within the soil just by my cropping system? Well, as it turns out, sorghum Sudan grasses and brassicas in the rotation in several studies have been shown to increase and improve the availability of calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, and sulfur. You think about even deep-rooted plants, right? To bring and mine those minerals up from the soil, bring them from lower regions in the soil profile up into the rhizospheres, where they can become biologically active and uptake through the plant. So I always like to think, okay, what kind of cropping system can I implement here, and maybe use livestock grazing as well, in order to kind of help complete this cycle, so that I don't have to be buying so many inputs. If I can get it from the ground, if it's there, and if I can encourage that cycling by having healthy soil, that's what I want to do, right? And then I'm going to apply macro and micronutrients according to soil test if it's needed, because guess what? I got to get a crop to the market. I got to feed the kids, right? I got to pay the bills. So that's what we're going to do. So I think that just really shows the importance of organic matter. It's really interesting to know that each percent of organic matter that exists in the upper 6 to 8 inches of the soil contains about 100 pounds of sulfur per acre. That's a lot of sulfur. Now, like nitrogen, whatever, right? Like phosphorus, it's not, a lot of that is not plant available. Only a small fraction of that is available at any given time. And again, Darren, you were talking about right time, right place. That's what that soil microorganism community is doing, is just making sure that stuff is mineralized at the right time and right place, and the plants can uptake it. So it has to be mineralized to be taken up by those plants, much the same way that organic nitrogen is. The bottom line there is the lower the organic matter content of the soil, the more likely sulfur deficiency is going to occur. That's kind of like was my bottom line takeaway as I was like reading of this and thinking about the different farmers that I've worked with over time with various soil deficiencies is like, let's build a healthy soil. Let's really feed those microorganisms. Let's soil test for a baseline, and then every year or 2 or 3 after that to see where we're going, right? Let's look at our plants, right? If you're growing crops and you start to notice, chlorosis within your plants, the first thing I often think about is nitrogen deficiency, but sulfur has the same symptoms.
Yeah, I love like being able to read the plants and like clues for which element it's deficient in. And I read that since nitrogen is mobile in the plants, it's usually the older leaves that get yellowed, but with sulfur, it's less mobile in the plants. So it's the younger leaves that turn yellow when it's sulfur deficient, which is, I think, very interesting.
I think that's fantastic, thinking about how to read plants like that. But you're right, and so I think just like it's that system of like, if we build it, they will come, right? And that takes management on the part of the farmer or the gardener, and it takes that a really good system of crop rotation and cover crops and compost, and if you can get livestock onto your fields, that is an excellent way to cycle nutrients, not only sulfur but phosphorus and potassium and nitrogen as well. I was thinking of something else. It's a lot of people will use sulfur for a fungicide, and Darron, I did not know that it doesn't kill fungus. However, elemental sulfur is on the national list of approved substances for organic producers for both crops and for livestock for insect control. And much like diatomaceous earth, it will cause desiccation of a lot of insects. And so many organic farmers will sprinkle elemental sulfur and diatomaceous earth on the backs of their animals for like fly control, things like this, as well as using it for an insect control on crop. So there's an awful lot of uses, and it's been a long-standing element that we have used, and in a lot of parts of the countries it's even taken for granted because their soils have adequate amounts of sulfur, and nutrient cycling is kicking into gear in those areas that don't have it, much like some of the micronutrients. There's a lot of areas with micronutrient deficiencies, think boron or selenium or things like this that need to be addressed. So again, it just shows the importance of soil testing. Anyway, I'll ramble forever. Any last thoughts?
Well, one thing that I found interesting, because I must have learned about sulfur in school when I was studying soils, but I didn't remember much. So much of the sulfur information I found analogous to other elements, like the nitrogen cycle. It's very similar to the nitrogen cycle, and thinking about how we need the biology to mineralize the sulfur, just like we do with nitrogen. And then when you were talking about making sure to apply it in the fall so that it has time to really do its thing and be available to plants in the spring, I was like, well, that's just like calcium when you add lime, it needs time to. So there's so many analogies with sulfur and these other elements, and I thought was interesting.
Yeah, it really is, and again, for a lot of producers and even a lot of scientists, it's like sulfur takes a backseat to nitrogen. It's like nitrogen is like the queen of all nutrients, right? For most producers, because it produces, the proteins and it produces the growth and all of this, but without these other nutrients, you're going to have deficiency. I think it was, potassium deficiency on my tomatoes this year. The first time ever, right? I never fertilized. It's all just cover crops. So I thought, it's like, I'm gonna do a soil health test this fall and see what's going on.
I'm wondering if either of y'all in your research, I came across this one article and even I could not fully grasp it, but it was basically saying that they also could use sulfur in soil tests as a measurement of how much water has been through that soil. Almost to me, what it sounded like was almost like carbon dating, was like, the difference in isotopes or whatever that, they could, guesstimate a date. They could do that with sulfur in the soil and figure out how much water moves through that soil. Either
So
y'all.
the first thing no, I've never heard that, Darren, but the first thing it makes me think of is like, is that because it is so leachable
Mhm.
and it leaves footprints maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, I haven't heard of that either, but because it's a negative ion in the soil as opposed to, so an anion as opposed to a cation like calcium and magnesium. It leaches like nitrate. And so I could see like if there was more sulfur deeper in the soil profile, then there would have been more water moving through that soil profile. But if there's more in the upper parts of the soil profile, then there's less water? I don't know. Are we talking geologic time here or?
You've just articulated kind of what I was thinking though really well, Nina. It's like footprints of water in that look like blotches of sulfur.
Right. Yeah. And also, I mean, if there's like an anaerobic environment like a swamp, and then sulfur builds up like that, and then it gets buried and becomes, I don't know, a fossil fuel. Now I'm just making stuff up.
No, interesting stuff. Maybe it could be used for evaluating the engineering characteristics of certain soils for construction or roads or whatever. But yeah, fascinating how these various elements that we have been discussing just like impact our lives in so many different ways.
From chopping onions to growing onions to
lying to our kids.
Lying to our children. I think we've covered sulfur. If people have questions, they can always get in touch with us through all of the ATTRA phone line or email, Ask an Ag Expert, or askanag@ncat.org. Get in touch with us.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to keep going through the periodic table, I think. No spoilers as to what's next. We'll keep
I can't wait till we do plutonium. I don't know where that figures into agriculture, but
hey, we'll find the connection.
We'll find a connection. We will, sure. Very cool. Well, it's always a pleasure to hang out with you two. I learn something every time we get together.
Yeah,
Definitely.
likewise. All right.
Well, everybody, until the next time you hear from us, happy farming.
Happy farming.
Have a good fall.
Have a good fall. Do a soil test. See how your sulfur's doing.
Yep.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Additional information about this episode and related resources can be found at attra.ncat.org. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe to Voices from the Field wherever you get your podcasts. ATTRA, Voices from the Field, is produced by the National Center for Appropriate Technology, headquartered in Butte, Montana. It's supported by the USDA Rural Business Cooperative Service as part of NCAT's ATTRA Sustainable Agriculture Program. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this recording are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of the USDA or NCAT. We'll catch you again next week, and until then, keep on farming.